Greetings, brothers and sisters. Salama Siemi. Shalom. Welcome to Covenant Awakenings. And so today I wanted to focus on something a little bit outside of the sound doctrine of the Israelite community. Um, this video is really to address a video that Teo had and the guests that he had in terms of moving to Africa and knowing what to invest in or what to work in um, when you're looking at that transition to the motherland. So, this is going to be one of a series of videos I plan on doing with Covenant Awakenings. And that's to give everybody more of an insight and a focus of what each country plans to offer. So I'm going to focus in on a couple of the whole scale and delve in from there. So my first video is going to be focusing on the African Union. And so the African Union, it's just going to be a quick glance of what is going on in the economic sphere of the African Union. So I want to give you this picture here because this is what um, the African Union's all about. You're going to have a plethora of different shades, colors, um, dynamics that encompasses the largest continent in the world. And the continent's so large that it can fit in China a few times, America a few times, and even Russia, I think, 1.5 times. So, in terms of the vastness that Africa has, the African Union would be a great resource in terms of being able to provide a holistic approach of managing um, the economics. So, let me give you a background in the history of the African Union. It was officially launched in 2002, and that was coming off of its predecessor, the Organization of African Unity from 1963 to 1999. Back in the 1940s, Ghana was one of the first countries to launch its independence. And when it launched its independence, you had countries like DRC, Tanzania, and a whole host of African countries began to gain their independence. So as they began to gain their independence, Ghana really took the lead on trying to create an economic bloc and a military bloc to protect the resources in Africa. Now, we see what history provided because, in terms of the teeth that um, that the Organization of African Unity provided, it was very paper tigerish. So the aim of the African Union is to actually establish something with a little bit more power and bite. And we've seen this with the many missions that the African Union has undertaken. They have something called AMISOM, and that's the African mission in Somalia. And that is a primarily led African Union initiative to be able to provide peacekeeping operations within the Somalian borders. So we have different mechanisms that we've seen with the African Union, but I want to take a look and delve in to the actual economic piece of this. And you're going to see a little bit of tertiary glances in terms of how you have to have a holistic approach to economics, because you have to understand that you have to have diplomatic, information infrastructure, military approaches to provide that whole lens of how you're going to have economic diversity and viability. So the key point on this slide is the African Union wanted to ensure that it invite and encourage the full participation of the African diaspora as an important part of our continent in the building of the African Union. So don't ever let people tell you that looking at Africa or try to invest in Africa is something that's a far reach or impossible. Honestly, I would say that is contrary to what the goal of the African Union is, and this is what they stated. They want us to be there to be able to build up, because we know as Israelites, that's where we come from. Now, in terms of Northeast Africa, Eastern Africa, those discussions can be made for a later day and a later time. But as we see going forward, the best investment that we have to the continent is not just capital, but human capital. So if you search in the African Union website, the African Union wants to have a couple of agendas. And one of the biggest agendas is Agenda 2063. And so, just taking a snippet out of it, it says Africa's blueprint and master plan for transforming Africa into the global powerhouse of the future. So, if we look at that in context, Africa has the largest resources in the world. The continent is the actual bread maker and the resource provider for all of the other countries. And I say this because if I can give you an anecdote, that back in 2017, when we had a former Secretary of State, Rex Tillerson, he was dispatched to go to Africa to mend ties with African countries. And I believe he had gone to either Nigeria or Kenya. I want to say Nigeria. And that was because Trump had said that African countries were, quote unquote, S-hole countries. You can fill in the rest. And based on that quote, it was about 48 hours later, Rex Tillerson was on a plane trying to gain and curry favor and understanding with the African nations. And it was at that time that this was the world's first, especially America's first, that we saw a high-ranking government official get fired in an airplane while in mid-flight. That's saying you don't have a job when you hit the ground, and don't even ask. So, what does that mean? It means that Africa is very, very important. And it's a very important strategic point for most of the countries in the world. And if you're thinking that Africa doesn't have economic dominance, you better think again, because they're starting to understand that they know their position and they're realizing their position. So just as we're waking up here in America, they're waking up in the land and they're realizing who they are. This is just part of the process of the two sticks coming together. So going on in this slide, there's an African capacity report, and that's found within the African Union website. And the report goes off of the conditions that create the economic viability to do business in the African Union. And so there are certain programs that are offered by the AU that provide economic sustainment. And I'm not going to get into all those programs because when I start to delve into these different countries, I'm going to go in and talk a little bit more in terms of what those countries have to offer to be able to build businesses and other economic programs within those regions, depending on where you're at in Africa. Some regions are going to be more mineral heavy with oils and things of that nature. Other regions will be mineral ready or rich with gold and other different metals, precious metals. Um, like in Tanzania, Tanzanite. And I still recall a story about 2 weeks ago where a Tanzanian farmer found about 5 pounds worth of Tanzanite, and he was an overnight millionaire because of the amount of Tanzanite he found and just the value of those materials. So, in the reality of things, if Africa was able to control its minerals in a better capacity, um, you will understand the amount of wealth that the African Union is sitting on, and this is why they're trying to formulate that global powerhouse of the future initiative. So when we're understanding the African Capacity Index, it's a scaling system that's based on the potential economic conditions that can be developed. Again, potential economic conditions. And so those potential economic conditions means that if the bettering or the improvement of the social structures of security, of lessening the corruption and other cultural practices that have been used to cause damage towards that country, if those factors can be limited, then the ability to export and import materials to those specific nations will provide that economic vibrance that that country could achieve and honestly should achieve. So those policies, guidelines, the enforcement of corruption and other external environmental factors. And I look at the external environmental factors as tribalism because that's a big thing that they deal with in Africa, but we don't really deal with that here in the United States due to just the conditions that you have. Now, here in the United States, we have laws on the books for nepotism and things of that nature. And we always try, quote unquote, they try to provide, self identifying or, things of that nature for affirmative action or, anti discrimination efforts. How well they do those efforts, it's to be still to be determined. So when we're dealing with Africa, we have to deal with another reality that Africa is a whole lot different because of the cultural influences and the norms that they have. And even in the African Union, when they um, had highlighted that in their African capacity reporting, they made a mention that the accusations of corruption among the bureaucratic leadership in some African countries led to the promulgation of codes of conduct and ethics in whistleblower legislation. So Africa is on the right track to put policies in place and on the books, but the enforcement of those policies are still It's kind of what we still see here in the United States. You know, anti-racism, anti-discrimination. That is policies that's on the books. However, the enforcement of it is still very vague and ambiguous. So when you're looking at each country, be sure that you want to zero in on what you want to provide to that country. Um, you have to look at it, it's a service. You're providing something for them to get better at, to do better at, and to be better at. We have had an enormous amount of education and our backgrounds of being able to conduct business on a global setting has allowed us to have a leg up in the global economic outreach. And so that is something that they're lacking, and that capacity is what they're trying to be able to resolve. If we come in with our know how and experience to be able to get the vital resources in the place and to stage those vital resources, that becomes the economic juggernaut, because once you're able to provide interior infrastructure, the exterior infrastructure within the global economic framework is much more easier and becomes much more easier to access. So when we think about these problems, we have to actually look at those problems in the microeconomic scale before we tackle the bigger problem. And that's where you want to make sure in places, just for example, in Tanzania, if you look at different references like the CIA World Fact Book, Britannica, the encyclopedia, the International Monetary Fund, IMF, who a lot of these UN sponsored or international based strategy and planning groups, they'll give you some good references and materials to be able to research what that country is lacking. And so in Tanzania, just for example, Tanzania was showing that it's lacking electricity. So if we know that it's lacking electricity, then we understand, okay, what does Tanzania need to have to build that electricity or electric grid? And having that electric grid be able to function in the maintenance of that electric grid so that it can continue to maintain steady power output. Because when you have that steady power output, then you have comfortability and security. And so that comfortability comes into a form that you can now have air conditioning. You can now have appliances that don't have to worry about power surges or things of that nature breaking down those appliances if you don't have a universal protection supply or an UPS device. So these are some of the things that we have to start thinking about, because we understand that based off of how we live and how we perform, we can be able to provide those um, those insights that they desperately need. So when you're planning for the future, again, the African Union website, this is just a holistic website in terms of how the African Union is set up. And so, yes, you may be able to find some funding ideas or some sort of grants or scholarships, but keep in mind that it's kind of waning. So don't go with the expectation that you'll be able to find some sort of economic um, grants or policies that will be favorable for building economic conditions. No, you have to think of it from you're creating that business plan bef- more tedious than a standard business plan, because you may have to have more projects within your portfolio that will create that end goal or that end state for that original project to be able to materialize. So, again, in terms of being able to understand how you're going to invest your money or where you're going to invest your money, here are some simple things. Reach out to those specific countries and ask. The best people to ask are the people on the ground. That's an adage that we use. Look, in order to understand the business needs, you need to ask the people, what do you need? So we can do that through forums, websites, discussions, and we have different forums through Twitter, YouTube, Instagram. So social media is really a very good power conduit of being able to have that knowledge and insight within multiple communication streams. And so when we think about that, we have to also understand we need to manage our expectations because our standards are so much greater. Listen, when you're there in those countries, they don't really have a running water system or sewage system that we're accustomed to. A lot of them will still have kind of the old septic tanks like you're living in the country. And most of them will still have water storage tanks or containers that's plumbed to their roof to allow for the water pressure to go throughout the house. And if you leave on a faucet or you have something that's dripping or you lose on out the water capacity, you may actually run out of water until the next water filling day or time is scheduled. And so these are kind of the things that we definitely have to understand when we go into these countries, because the idea is to take our expertise and have them run with it, because we understand what we need and they will tailor what we know to their needs, which is just it's synergy. So how much is a continent worth? So according to the africareport.com, it's just one, and this is just one because I want to dive into a little bit of the context here, especially with what we see on social media outlets and things of that nature. The continent of Africa is worth over $2.2 trillion. So let that sink in. Let that sink in. If the continent of Africa is worth over $2.2 trillion and you have Europe that still makes Africa pay over $1.6 trillion a year. Think about that. That's over 3/4 of their wealth going to a European country. So that's a dire circumstance that they're living in. Imagine that you have $1, but you only get to keep 25 cents of that dollar. That's a struggle. So this is a little bit more than just us awakening. This is more than just us being able to understand who we are in terms of being Israelites. So I want that to sink on in. And also think about a few months ago when the UN peacekeepers got found out because one of their transport trucks had tipped over. And when it tipped over, they found loads of minerals, diamonds, gold, silver, other gemstones, things of that nature that had been mined. And then you have it ransacked. So this is just the $2.2 trillion that's being said and reported. Unfortunately, we know that that's more than the $2.2 trillion. And it's a shame that their reporting is based off of what they're able to see. Now, if they were able to report everything that they touch, I'm pretty confident that it would be a whole lot more than $2.2 trillion. And I'm very confident that Africa would be able to have a lot more economic vibrance than what they're able to have after being cheated. So when we look at these things, I want to go ahead and take a look at the CIA Additional World Fact Book, the Encyclopedia Britannica, and also other resources that I had just mentioned. So if you like what I do, besides the music, please donate, like, share, and subscribe. And the next time, I'm going to do a little bit better, because many will go here and there to increase knowledge. That's in Daniel chapter 12 and 4. And this is Covenant Awakenings. So we're awakening all of Israel, whether by blood or through spiritual grafting in. Shalom, Salama, Siemi.